Is death really the end? For medieval folks, especially the ones with power and respect, passing away was just a new chapter, often marked by astonishing rituals. How much would someone pay for their heart to be buried in a special place? What kind of funeral party would throw a feast that lasted for days? How did they try to keep bodies from decaying in the year 1340? Get ready to dive into the truly wild, exclusive, and often bizarre world of medieval funerary practices, reserved for the most respected elders. Number 1. Use of exotic shrouds and caskets. Imagine the quiet solemnity of a medieval church, the air thick with the scent of incense and old stone. A revered elder, perhaps a powerful duke or a wise bishop, has passed away. For most people during the Middle Ages, the journey to the grave was a simple affair. A body wrapped in a plain linen shroud would be lowered directly into the consecrated earth of the churchyard. But for those at the very pinnacle of society, the final wardrobe was anything but humble. Their shrouds, the very cloths that enveloped them for eternity, were often shimmering masterpieces of global trade and immense wealth. A testament to their earthly power even in death, these were not just any textiles. We are talking about fabrics that crossed vast distances, carried on camelback through deserts, sailed across stormy seas, and bartered for in bustling markets, from Cairo to Constantinople. The finest silks, often imported from the Byzantine Empire, or even further from the distant lands of China, were highly prized. These silks were soft, luxurious, and incredibly expensive. A commodity akin to gold or jewels, a shroud made of pure silk spoke volumes about the deceased's standing, a whispered declaration of their wealth and influence that few living souls could ever match. Beyond mere silk, some shrouds were woven with threads of pure gold, creating a cloth of dazzling opulence. These were not simply decorative additions. The gold threads were an integral part of the fabric, shimmering and catching the light, even in the dim confines of a tomb. Such textiles, sometimes known as cloth of gold or samite, represented the ultimate expression of material extravagance. A deceased elder laid to rest in such a shroud was literally wrapped in their accumulated fortune. A final, public, and undeniable display of their status to anyone who witnessed the preparation of their body. Consider the detailed artistry that went into some of these funerary textiles. While many shrouds might have been plain in their opulent material, others were intricately embroidered. These embroideries often featured symbols of the deceased's lineage, their heraldic crests or religious motifs. Skilled artisans, perhaps nuns or professional embroiderers working in convents or court workshops, would spend countless hours stitching delicate patterns, turning the shroud into a work of art. The threads themselves could be dyed with rare and expensive pigments, blues from indigo, purples from murex shells, and reds from kermes, insects, each color adding to the overall cost and prestige of the garment. These colors faded over centuries, but in their prime they would have been vibrant, a riot of richness against the somber backdrop of death. For instance, historical accounts and archaeological discoveries hint at the grandeur of these shrouds. When the tomb of King Edward I of England was opened, centuries after his death, in 1307, chroniclers described how his body, though decayed, was still encased in what appeared to be a rich cloth of gold. While the exact material might be debated by modern historians, the very description points to the expectation of a king being buried in textiles of extraordinary value. Another notable example, though not a royal burial, is the shroud of Saint Cuthbert, buried in 687 AD. While earlier than the peak of the High Middle Ages, discoveries from his tomb in Durham Cathedral revealed fragments of incredibly fine silk, including one known as the nature goddess silk, intricately woven and likely imported from distant lands. This tradition of using precious textiles for the venerated dead carried through the entire medieval period, amplifying with the rise of global trade. The caskets themselves, while often secondary to the shroud's opulence, also reflected the deceased's standing. For the vast majority, a simple wooden coffin, perhaps unadorned, was the norm. But for the elite, the wooden casket could be made of expensive, imported timbers, meticulously carved, and even inlaid with precious metals or ivory. These caskets might then be lined with more fine silks or velvets, creating a plush resting place. In some cases, especially for royalty or very high nobility, lead coffins were used, sometimes within a wooden outer casket. Lead was heavy, expensive to procure and work, and offered a greater degree of protection and durability, signifying a desire for the body to remain undisturbed for centuries. Such a coffin, for example, entombed King John of England after his death in 1216, a practical choice for preserving a royal corpse, but also an implicit statement of status. The visual impact of these elaborate shrouds and caskets was significant during the funeral rites, although the body would eventually be hidden from view. The preparation, the dressing of the deceased in their finery, was often a solemn and public affair for the household and close associates. The sheer display of wealth, even in death, served as a powerful reminder of the deceased's position and the family's continued prosperity. It was a final, undeniable flourish, a last act of earthly display before the soul embarked on its spiritual journey. The contrast between the commoner's simple linen and the elder's silk and gold was stark, a vivid illustration of the rigid social hierarchy of the medieval world. It was not just about comfort in the afterlife. It was about demonstrating enduring power and influence. Even the process of acquiring these materials was a mark of distinction. Securing exotic silks meant having access to the vast networks of international trade, the wealth to pay for them, and the connections to have them transformed into a fitting final garment. Only a few could command such resources. The reverence for these materials also extended to the spiritual realm. While the Church emphasized the equality of souls before God, the earthly trappings of death for respected elders often mirrored the grandeur of religious vestments. The very fabrics of their shrouds, sometimes woven with Christian symbols, blurred the lines between temporal power and spiritual devotion. A bishop, for instance, might be buried in a silk mitre and richly embroidered vestments, mimicking the sacred attire they wore in life, further emphasizing their spiritual authority and their journey towards a heavenly reward. Ultimately, the use of exotic shrouds and elaborate caskets for respected elders in the Middle Ages was more than just a matter of taste. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, a final act of display that underscored their unique position in society. It was a silent yet powerful proclamation of wealth, influence, and the lasting legacy of individuals who had commanded respect and resources throughout their lives. Even as their bodies returned to dust, the memory of their grandeur, reinforced by these opulent funeral adornments, was meant to endure. These were not merely clothes for the dead. They were monuments woven in fabric, a tangible legacy of a life lived at the apex of medieval society. Number 2. Grand funeral processions and feasts. When a respected elder, especially a king, a high-ranking noble, or a powerful bishop, passed away in the Middle Ages, their passing was not a quiet affair. It was a carefully choreographed spectacle, a powerful public performance that served to underscore their immense wealth, influence, and the enduring power of their lineage. This spectacle often culminated in grand funeral processions that snaked through towns and cities, followed by lavish feasts that could feed thousands, marking a clear distinction between the mourning of the elite and the simple burial of common folk. The funeral procession itself was a visual symphony of power and grief. Imagine the scene: the slow, deliberate tolling of church bells, a somber sound echoing across the medieval landscape. The streets would be thronged with onlookers, hushed and respectful as the procession began its stately journey towards the final resting place. At the head of the procession might be priests carrying crosses and censers, their chants mingling with the mournful laments of professional mourners hired for the occasion. Following them would be servants, often dressed in new, dark livery, carrying torches or banners emblazoned with the deceased's heraldry. Then came the coffin, often draped in a rich pall of black velvet or cloth of gold, perhaps borne on the shoulders of the most esteemed pallbearers or drawn on a specially decorated hearse, pulled by horses caparisoned in black. For royalty, the coffin might be accompanied by an effigy, a life-sized representation of the deceased in their finest clothes placed on top of the coffin for public viewing. This effigy would sometimes even have articulated limbs, allowing it to be posed in a lifelike manner, a ghostly stand-in for the departed. This practice, seen in the funerals of English monarchs like Edward III and Henry V, allowed the populace to witness a symbolic presence of their ruler, even as their actual body was concealed. The procession would stretch for what seemed like miles, a moving testament to the deceased's extensive network of allegiances. High-ranking nobles, important clergy, and representatives from towns and guilds who owed fealty or respect to the deceased would follow their ranks, ordered by strict rules of social precedence. Each group, from the highest duke to the humblest guildsman, knew their place, a visual representation of the social hierarchy that had governed the deceased's life. Torches, often hundreds of them, would be carried even during the day, their flickering flames symbolizing the light of the soul and the warmth of memory. While also adding to the dramatic effect, the sheer scale of these processions was astounding. When Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I of England, died in 1290, her body was transported over several weeks from Harby, Nottinghamshire, to Westminster Abbey. Each night where her body rested, an elaborate cross known as an Eleanor cross was later erected. This epic journey was a prolonged public funeral procession, attracting crowds at every stop, demonstrating the profound sorrow and respect commanded by the Queen. The expenses involved in such a prolonged display were colossal, including the cost of hundreds of horses, riders, and the daily maintenance of a royal funeral entourage. After the solemnity of the burial, the mood would shift to a grand funeral feast. This was not merely a meal, it was a continuation of the display of wealth and power. The number of guests could be enormous, ranging from hundreds to thousands, encompassing everyone from the highest nobles to the deceased's tenants and household servants. The feast served multiple purposes. It was a gesture of hospitality and gratitude to those who attended the funeral, a symbol of the family's continuing generosity and capacity to provide, and a powerful demonstration of their enduring resources. Despite the loss of a principal member, the menus for these feasts were nothing short of extravagant. Multiple courses would be served, featuring a wide array of meats: roasted venison, boar's heads, swans, peacocks, and various game birds. Fish would be abundant, especially on fast days. Pies, pastries, and sweet treats would be served along with copious amounts of ale and wine. Spices, imported at great expense, would flavor every dish, further signaling the host's wealth. Records from the funeral of Sir John Fastolf in 1459 detail an extensive feast with multiple courses, consuming vast quantities of meat, bread, and ale, grotting the immense logistical effort and cost entailed. For the very wealthy, these feasts could last for several days, turning the period of mourning into an extended social event. The sheer quantity of food and drink required extensive planning, the hiring of extra cooks and servers, and the procurement of provisions on an industrial scale. The waste, though unintended, could also be significant, a testament to the abundance. It was not uncommon for the remaining food to be distributed to the poor, a final act of charity that further burnished the deceased's reputation and piety. The costs associated with these grand funeral processions and feasts were astronomical. They represented a significant portion of a noble family's expenditure, often bankrupting lesser households who attempted to emulate the elite. These expenses included payments for the clergy, musicians, and professional mourners, the cost of vast quantities of food and drink, new clothes for the household, and the fabrication of elaborate banners and effigies. The cost was seen as an investment in the family's social standing and a demonstration of their power, ensuring that the deceased's legacy, and by extension, their families, would endure. The social implications of these events were profound. They reinforced the existing social hierarchy with the elite, demonstrating their preeminence through their lavish displays, while simultaneously fostering a sense of community and shared grief, at least among those invited to participate. They provided a public space for mourning, allowing people to process the loss of a figure who might have held significant sway over their lives. For the family, the funeral was a chance to publicly affirm their continued authority and cohesion even in the face of loss. The display of power inherent in these grand funerals was so potent that sumptuary laws were sometimes enacted to limit their extravagance. Though these laws were often flouted by those with sufficient means and influence, in essence, the grand funeral processions and feasts for respected elders in the Middle Ages were far more than simple farewells. They were elaborate theatrical performances, public declarations of wealth, power, and enduring legacy. Every detail, from the mournful chants to the last morsel of the feast, was carefully calculated to impress upon all witnesses the extraordinary stature of the deceased, ensuring that their passing would be remembered not just as a loss, but as a magnificent final flourish. Number 3. Rudimentary embalming and preparation for display. The medieval approach to death, particularly for the revered and powerful, often included efforts to preserve the body, albeit in ways that might seem rudimentary by modern standards. For kings, high nobility, and venerated saints, the practical necessity of transporting a body over long distances or delaying burial for significant ceremonial events meant that some form of embalming or special preparation. This was not a common practice. It was an exclusive privilege reserved for the elite, a testament to their status and the importance of their public display, even in death. Unlike the sophisticated chemical embalming processes developed in later centuries, medieval methods focused on slowing decay, using readily available natural substances. The process often began with evisceration, the removal of internal organs that were the first to decompose. These organs, sometimes placed in separate containers, might be buried in a different location, a practice known as corpus separatum, which we will explore further. After removal, the body cavity would be thoroughly cleaned and then filled with a mixture of aromatic spices, herbs, and absorbent materials. Imagine the work of the medieval embalmer. They were often surgeons, apothecaries, or even monks with a knowledge of anatomy and preserving agents. Spices like myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and aloe, all expensive and imported from distant lands, were favored for their antiseptic and aromatic properties. These would be crushed into powders and packed into the eviscerated cavities. Salt, a common preservative, was also used sometimes in large quantities. The body might then be soaked in alcohol such as wine or spirits or even vinegar to further inhibit decomposition. Some accounts suggest the use of wax or resin to coat the body, providing an outer protective layer. One famous, if gruesome, example is that of Edward I of England, who died in 1307. Legends and some historical accounts claim that his body was so meticulously embalmed that it remained remarkably well preserved for centuries, an incorruptible king. While the extent of this preservation is debated by historians, it illustrates the aspiration and effort put into such preparations. His body, it is said, was eviscerated, filled with aromatic compounds, and then wrapped in waxed cloths before being placed in a lead coffin. Such a process would have been incredibly costly and involved highly skilled individuals. For saints, the goal of preservation was often even more profound. An incorruptible body was seen as a sign of divine favor, a miracle confirming the holiness of the deceased. While true incorruption is rare and often due to natural mummification processes, medieval accounts of saints whose bodies remained seemingly intact were powerful tools for promoting their cults and attracting pilgrims. For example, the body of Saint Louis IX of France, who died in Tunis during a crusade in 1270, was prepared for transport back to France. His internal organs were removed and buried in Tunisia, while his bones and flesh were boiled and scraped clean to facilitate transport and ensure some form of preservation for the long journey back to France. This drastic process ensured that his remains, once back on French soil, could be venerated. The preparation for display, often referred to as lying in state, was another key aspect of these exclusive funerary rites. For monarchs and high-ranking nobles, the deceased's body, or sometimes a lifelike effigy, would be publicly displayed for a period before burial. This allowed important dignitaries, loyal subjects, and the general populace to pay their last respects. This display was not merely about viewing the body. It was a powerful political statement, affirming the continuity of power and the legitimacy of the successor. The body, once prepared, would be dressed in its finest attire, often coronation robes for a monarch, or episcopal vestments for a bishop. It would be laid on a grand bed of state, or of bier, often under a canopy, surrounded by candles, incense, and a guard of honor. For instance, when Henry VII, the first Tudor King of England, died in 1509, his body lay in state for several days at Richmond Palace, allowing his court and favored subjects to mourn. The scene would have been one of solemn grandeur intended to inspire awe and respect. The practicalities of this rudimentary embalming were complex. It required an understanding of basic anatomy and sanitation, as well as access to rare and expensive materials. The services of the embalmers themselves, often skilled surgeons or apothecaries, would have commanded significant fees. The process was often performed in great haste, given the rapid onset of decay. The very act of preparing the body in this way, rather than allowing it to decompose naturally, highlighted the exceptional status of the deceased. The public display of the body or effigy served as a crucial transitional ritual. It allowed for the orderly transfer of allegiance from the deceased to their heir, providing a tangible link to the past while ushering in the new reign. The solemnity of the viewing, the public mourning, and the sheer visual impact of the prepared body or its effigy reinforced the majesty of the office and the enduring nature of the institution, whether it was the monarchy or the church. In stark contrast, for common people, there was no embalming, no lying in state. The body would be washed, shrouded, and buried as quickly as possible, usually within a day or two to prevent the spread of disease, and out of practical necessity. The effort and expense dedicated to preserving the bodies of the elite underscore the profound difference in how death was treated across the social strata of medieval society. It was not just about respecting the dead, it was about maintaining the order and projecting the power of the living. These rudimentary embalming practices were a testament to the extraordinary importance placed upon the physical remains of those who wielded immense power and garnered widespread respect during their lives. Number 4. Perpetual chantry endowments and masses. In the spiritual landscape of medieval Europe, the concept of purgatory loomed large. This intermediate state, where souls underwent purification before ascending to heaven, was a source of great anxiety for respected elders of immense wealth and power that desired to shorten their time, or indeed the time of their loved ones, in purgatory. Was a driving force behind one of the most exclusive and enduring funerary practices, the perpetual chantry endowment. This involved leaving substantial fortunes, not just for a one-off prayer, but for an ongoing eternal cycle of masses to be said for their souls. A chantry endowment was a colossal financial commitment. It meant bequeathing significant amounts of land, property, rents, or large sums of money to a church, monastery, or specific collegiate institution. The condition for this bequest was explicit. In return for the endowment, a priest or a college of priests would be retained specifically to say masses for the soul of the deceased, and often their family, for as long as the world endured. This was not a donation. It was a contract with eternity, secured through earthly wealth. The tangible manifestation of these endowments was often the chantry chapel, These were specific chapels, built within larger churches or cathedrals, or sometimes freestanding structures, dedicated solely to the performance of these perpetual masses. These chapels were often grand, richly decorated, and sometimes housed the tomb of the founder. Their construction and maintenance, along with the stipends for the chantry priests, were all covered by the endowment. For instance, Winchester Cathedral, like many other large medieval churches, contains numerous chantry chapels, each founded by a wealthy bishop or nobleman, often with their elaborate tombs within. The chapel of William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester and founder of New College, Oxford, and Winchester College, is a prime example of such a monumental dedication. Built to ensure prayers for his soul into perpetuity, the motivation behind these endowments were complex. Foremost was profound religious piety and a deep-seated belief in the efficacy of intercessory prayer. The more masses said, the more prayers offered. The quicker a soul's passage through purgatory was believed to be. It was a spiritual insurance policy, purchased at the highest price. Beyond personal salvation, chantry foundations also served as a powerful statement of social standing and dynastic pride. A perpetual chantry was a visible, lasting monument to a family's wealth, influence, and devotion, ensuring their name was invoked daily in sacred prayer, long after their earthly lives concluded. For example, some wealthy individuals would endow entire colleges or hospitals, attaching the condition that prayers for their souls be said daily. The founding of academic institutions, like Oxford or Cambridge colleges, often had chantry elements where part of the purpose of the foundation was to train priests who would, among other duties, pray for the founder. When Henry VI founded King's College, Cambridge, in the 15th century, one of the stated purposes was to have a body of scholars and clergy praying for his soul and the souls of his family. The administration of these chantries was meticulous. Wills from the period are often painstakingly detailed in their instructions regarding the number of masses, the specific prayers to be recited, the vestments to be used, and the precise daily schedule for the chantry priests. Priests dedicated to chantry service often lived in collegiate houses adjacent to the chapels, forming a community whose primary purpose was to pray for their benefactors. This level of organization speaks to the seriousness with which these spiritual investments were treated. The sheer cost meant that only a tiny fraction of the population could afford such a practice. It was the exclusive domain of royalty, the highest nobility, immensely wealthy merchants, and senior ecclesiastical figures who had accumulated vast personal fortunes. A common peasant, even a prosperous yeoman, could never dream of establishing a perpetual chantry. Their spiritual solace came from collective parish prayers or simple bequests to the local church. This financial barrier made chantry endowments the ultimate status symbol in death, distinguishing the truly powerful from everyone else. The legacy of these chantries extended beyond the spiritual. They injected significant wealth into the church, supporting numerous priests and contributing to the maintenance and beautification of ecclesiastical buildings. The construction of chantry chapels spurred architectural innovation and artistic patronage, leading to some of the most exquisite examples of medieval craftsmanship. Furthermore, they created employment for a dedicated class of chantry priests whose lives were devoted to a specific set of spiritual obligations tied to the wishes of their deceased benefactors. The practice flourished throughout the High and Late Middle Ages, particularly in England, becoming an integral part of the spiritual economy and social fabric. However, with the Reformation in the 16th century, many chantries were dissolved, their endowments confiscated, and their chapels dismantled, rejected the concept of purgatory and intercessory prayers for the dead. This dissolution marked the end of a unique and powerful expression of medieval piety and privilege. The perpetual chantry endowment stands as a powerful testament to the medieval elites' fervent belief in the afterlife, their fear of purgatory, and their willingness to deploy immense earthly wealth to secure spiritual advantage. It was a practice that blurred the lines between religious devotion and social display, ensuring that the names and souls of respected elders were remembered and prayed for, literally forever. It was a monumental undertaking, both spiritually and financially, cementing their legacy in stone and prayer long after their earthly reign had ended. Number 5. Placement within sacred spaces, churches and cathedrals. For the overwhelming majority of people in the Middle Ages, death meant burial in the consecrated ground of the local churchyard. These sprawling graveyards, often surrounding the parish church, were the final resting place for countless souls, piled layer upon layer over centuries. However, for a select few, the revered elders, the powerful, the pious, and the exceptionally wealthy, the honor of burial within the sacred walls of the church itself, or even the hallowed ground of a grand cathedral, was a privilege of immense significance. This internal placement was not merely about comfort. It was a profound statement of status, a claim to proximity to God, and a visual testament to their enduring legacy. To be buried within the church was to be buried among the saints, near the altar, close to the holy relics, and under the protection of the divine. This proximity was believed to confer spiritual benefits, aiding the soul's journey to heaven and ensuring perpetual prayers from the living congregation. It separated the elite from the common multitude, drawing a distinct line between the sacred and the profane, even in death. The most coveted locations within a church were the choir, the area around the main altar, and the transepts. Kings, queens, archbishops, and founders of cathedrals or monasteries often sought burial in these most hallowed spots. Consider Westminster Abbey in England, a pantheon of royalty where kings like Edward the Confessor, Henry III, Edward I, and many others are interred near the high altar in lavish tombs that testify to their power and piety. Similarly, the Basilica of Saint-Denis near Paris served as the primary burial ground for French monarchs, housing their remains in elaborate tombs, marking their eternal connection to the monarchy and the divine. Beyond the high altar, other prestigious locations included chapels dedicated to specific saints, or family chapels endowed by wealthy patrons. Many noble families built private chapels within churches or cathedrals, specifically designed to house their tombs and serve as places for family prayers and masses. These chapels, often richly decorated with stained glass, altarpieces, and sculptural elements, became personal mausoleums. Exclusive spaces for their lineage, the types of internal burials varied. Some were simple slabs set into the church floor, sometimes adorned with an engraved effigy or an inscription beneath which the body was interred. Others were elaborate wall tombs, sculpted monuments integrated into the church architecture. The most magnificent were freestanding sarcophagi or raised tombs, often topped with an effigy of the deceased, making a grand visual statement in the nave or chancel. These monuments were designed not just to contain the body, but to serve as permanent memorials, inviting prayer and remembrance. The process of securing such a burial place was complex and costly. It required significant donations to the church, often in the form of land money or valuable objects. A wealthy merchant might pay handsomely to have their tomb placed in a prominent position in their parish church, perhaps near the guild altar they had patronized. A bishop, having spent their life serving the church, might be interred in a specially prepared crypt or even beneath the episcopal throne, signifying their lifelong devotion and authority. The exclusivity of internal burial was reinforced by ecclesiastical law and custom. Churchyards were, for the general populace, symbolizing their earthly equality in death, but within the church a strict hierarchy was observed. The further one was from the altar, the less prestigious the burial spot. Crypts, while still within the church, were generally less desirable than the main floor, unless they were specifically designed as royal vaults or for saintly relics. Examples abound across Europe. In Germany, the cathedrals of Speyer and Worms House, the tombs of Holy Roman emperors. In Italy, Powerful merchant families like the Medici in Florence commissioned lavish tombs within basilicas, such as San Lorenzo. These burials were not merely about personal honor. They contributed to the spiritual authority and architectural grandeur of the churches themselves, creating a symbiotic relationship between the powerful dead and the sacred institutions they adorned. The significance of such placement cannot be overstated. It was a visible manifestation of divine favor and earthly power. To be buried inside the church meant one was truly of the church, intimately connected to its sacred purpose. It also meant a constant stream of prayers from the living, as congregants walked over or around the tombs, their steps a quiet testament to the enduring presence of the deceased. This constant remembrance was thought to significantly aid the soul's journey through purgatory. In contrast to the simplicity of churchyard burials, internal burials involved elaborate rituals, often including a procession of the body through the church, special blessings of the tomb, and multiple masses said specifically for the deceased. The ceremonies would be attended by high-ranking clergy and nobility, further cementing the exclusivity and importance of the event. The practice of internal church burial persisted throughout the Middle Ages and into the early modern period, until growing concerns about sanitation and the sheer overcrowding of church internal cemeteries. But for centuries, for the most respected elders, the right to rest within the hallowed walls of a church or cathedral was the ultimate privilege, a final monumental statement of their enduring power, piety, and an unshakable belief in the spiritual efficacy of their chosen resting place. Number 6. Elaborate effigy tombs and monumental sculptures. In the realm of medieval funerary practices for respected elders, few traditions made as grand and enduring a visual statement as the elaborate effigy tomb and monumental sculpture. These were not just markers. They were artistic masterpieces, meticulously crafted to immortalize the deceased in stone, wood, or metal, portraying them in their prime, dressed in their finest, and often surrounded by symbols of their earthly power and piety. These magnificent creations were exclusively reserved for royalty, high nobility, powerful bishops, and the wealthiest of merchants, serving as perpetual testaments to their status and legacies. An effigy tomb typically consisted of a large sarcophagus or chest-like structure, upon which rested a life-sized sculpted figure of the deceased. These figures, or effigies, were carved with remarkable detail, often aiming for a degree of portraiture, though always idealized, to present the individual at their most dignified and noble. They would be depicted in their most distinguished attire. A king in his coronation robes with crown and scepter, a knight in full armor with sword and shield, complete with mitre and crozier. Imagine stepping into Westminster Abbey, a treasury of such monuments. The tomb of Edward III, who died in 1377, features a bronze effigy of the king, complete with gilt bronze lions at his feet, and angels supporting his head. His wife, Philippa of Hainaut, also has a remarkable alabaster effigy. These weren't just static figures. They were often painted in vibrant colors, gilded with gold, and inlaid with precious stones, bringing them to a lifelike, almost theatrical presence. While centuries of wear and Protestant iconoclasm have faded much of their original splendor, the surviving traces hint at their initial dazzling appearance. The symbolism embedded in these sculptures, the recumbent pose, often with hands clasped in prayer, signified peaceful rest and devotion to God. Animals at the feet of the effigy were common. A lion symbolized courage and strength for men, while a dog symbolized loyalty and fidelity for women. Heraldic shields, coats of arms, and family mottos were frequently incorporated onto the tomb chest, loudly proclaiming the deceased's lineage and achievements for all eternity. The materials used for these effigies were themselves indicators of status. Alabaster, a soft, translucent stone, was highly prized for its ease of carving and its luminous quality. Marble, particularly white Carrara marble, imported from Italy, was even more exclusive and expensive, reserved for the wealthiest patrons. Bronze, often gilded, was also used, offering a remarkable level of detail and durability, though it was extraordinarily costly due to the complex casting process. The selection of material was a deliberate choice, reflecting not only aesthetic preferences, but also the patron's immense financial resources. The creation of an effigy tomb was a multi-year project, involving the collaborative efforts of master sculptors, masons, painters, and gilders. These artists were often highly esteemed and commissioned by the highest echelons of society. The workshops of sculptors like André Bounivet or Claus Sluter, who worked for the Burgundian dukes in the late 14th and early 15th centuries, produced some of the most emotionally resonant and technically advanced effigies of the period, such as the tomb of Philip the Bold at Chaumont. The precision and artistry involved were beyond the reach of all but the most powerful patrons. These monumental sculptures were almost invariably placed within churches or cathedrals, often in the most prominent locations. They were not merely memorials for the family, they were public monuments, a constant reminder of the deceased's presence and a focal point for public veneration and prayer. They served to reinforce the social order, visually affirming the deceased's elevated position within society and their continued spiritual influence. People walking through the church would see these magnificent figures and be reminded of the power and piety they represented. For knights and warriors, their effigies sometimes showed them in full plate armor, even with their helmets removed to reveal their faces, and sometimes with a sword by their side. This served as a visual testament to their martial prowess and their role in protecting their lands and faith. For bishops, their effigies would often depict them holding a crozier, the staff symbolizing their pastoral authority, and wearing their episcopal ring, a symbol of their office and spiritual marriage to the church. The concept of a cadaver tomb, or transitomb, also emerged in the later Middle Ages, particularly among the elite. These tombs depicted the deceased in a gruesome state of decomposition, sometimes alongside a more idealized effigy. This stark portrayal was a memento mori, a reminder of the fleeting nature of earthly life and the equality of all flesh and death. While unsettling, these highly realistic macabre effigies were also a display of wealth, as they required immense artistic skill and expensive materials to create such detailed decay. Ultimately, elaborate effigy tombs and monumental sculptures were far more than just gravestones. They were carefully crafted narratives in stone, designed to ensure the enduring legacy of respected elders. They proclaimed wealth, power, piety, and lineage, transforming the deceased from a fleeting human into an eternal icon. Within the sacred space of the church, they embodied the medieval elite's profound desire for remembrance, ensuring that even in death their influence continued to resonate through magnificent and lasting artistic expressions. Number 7. Separate heart and organ burial, corpus separatum. In the bewildering tapestry of medieval funerary practices reserved for the most respected elders, one stands out for its unique blend of practicality, piety, and sheer macabre ingenuity: the practice of corpus separatum, or the separate burial of body parts, most notably the heart. This was not a universal custom. It was an exclusive privilege. La nobility, crusading knights, and revered saints, individuals whose lives and deaths carried immense political, spiritual, or emotional weight. The primary impetus for corpus separatum often arose from necessity. When a powerful individual died far from their intended or ancestral burial ground, transporting an entire body, especially over long distances or during military campaigns, was a formidable challenge in an age without refrigeration. To address this, the body would undergo a process of rudimentary preservation and dismemberment. Imagine the scene: a royal figure, perhaps a king, dying on crusade in a distant land, or a queen passing away during a journey. The body would be brought to a nearby religious house or prepared on site, Surgeons or skilled apothecaries would perform the grisly but necessary task of evisceration, removing the internal organs, viscera, which were the first to decompose. The heart, the most symbolic organ, would often be removed with particular care. The flesh and bones might then be boiled or macerated to separate the flesh from the skeleton, or the body might simply be heavily embalmed and wrapped. These separated components would then be transported to different locations for burial. The reasons for this dismemberment were multifaceted. Practicality was paramount. By separating the organs and potentially boiling the flesh, the remaining skeletal parts, or more stable tissues, could be transported with less risk of putrefaction. For instance, after the death of Louis IX of France in Tunis during the Eighth Crusade in 1270, his body was dismembered. His heart and intestines were buried in Tunisia, while his skeleton was boiled and the bones transported back to France for burial at St. Denis Basilica, the traditional resting place of French kings. This method ensured that at least a portion of the monarch could be brought home for a proper royal burial, symbolizing the enduring power of the French crown. Beyond mere practicality, profound spiritual and emotional motivations drove the practice. The heart, considered the seat of the soul, emotion, and loyalty, was often granted a special burial. It might be interred in a church particularly beloved by the deceased, or in a monastery they had founded or patronized, or even in a land they had held dear. The symbolic gesture allowed a part of the individual to remain connected to a place of deep personal significance, even if their main body lay elsewhere. A prime example is Richard I, the Lionheart, King of England, who died in France in 1199. His heart was sent to Rouen Cathedral, symbolizing his deep affection for Normandy. His viscera, internal organs, were buried at the church of Chalus, where he died, and his body was interred at Fontefraud Abbey alongside his father, Henry II, and mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. This triple burial was a powerful, multi-layered statement of his various loyalties and spiritual aspirations across his extensive territories. For queens, the practice was also significant. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, died in Harby, Nottinghamshire, in 1290. Her body embarked on a long journey to Westminster Abbey with memorial crosses, Eleanor crosses, erected at each overnight stopping point. Her viscera were buried at Lincoln Cathedral, while her heart was interred with great solemnity at the Blackfriars Priory in London. These separate burials underscored her status as queen, her piety, and her connection to different parts of the realm. For crusaders, dying far from home was a constant threat. Corpus separatum offered a solution to bring a part of them back to their homeland or their family's ancestral lands. It allowed them to fulfill a spiritual vow to be buried in consecrated ground near their kin, even if their body had to undergo such a process. Saints were another category for whom corpus separatum was a key practice, though often for different reasons. Their bodies, or parts thereof, became relics, powerful objects of veneration. The distribution of a saint's heart, bones, or other organs to different churches could spread their spiritual influence and attract pilgrims to multiple sites. For example, the skull of St. Thomas Becket, martyred in 1170, was venerated in Canterbury, while other parts of his body were distributed as relics to various churches across Europe, demonstrating their widespread spy. The ritual surrounding these separate burials was often elaborate. The heart, often enclosed in a precious casket made of lead, silver, or even gold, would be carried in its own procession, sometimes even more solemnly than the main body, reflecting its symbolic importance. These heart caskets were often beautifully crafted and decorated, becoming works of art in themselves. The social and political implications of corpus separatum were considerable. It reinforced the immense power and widespread influence of these individuals even in death. It allowed a deceased ruler to maintain symbolic control or connection to different regions of their realm. For a saint, it facilitated the spread of their cult, bringing spiritual benefits to multiple communities. It was a practice that defied the natural unity of the body, yet served to solidify the enduring legacy and spiritual presence of the most revered figures of the age. It highlights a unique facet of medieval funerary customs, where even the physical remains of the elite were treated with an almost architectural precision, distributed across the landscape to fulfill various earthly and heavenly